The address was unremarkable. 19,940 West Dixie Highway sat in a quiet neighborhood of northeast Miami-Dade County, Florida, surrounded by palm trees and modest apartment buildings that looked like 1,000 others across South Florida. The area was working class, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other well enough to wave, but not well enough to know what happened behind closed doors. Cars passed by on their way to work, to school, to the grocery store. Life moved at its ordinary pace. But inside that apartment, something unspeakable was happening. 3 young girls were living in conditions that would later be described by prosecutors as a house of horrors. They were hungry, their small bodies bearing the marks of systematic torture. They were not allowed to attend school regularly. When they were hungry enough to sneak food meant for someone else in the household, they paid a price that defies comprehension. Their hands were held down on a hot stove or skin burned until they learned never to reach for food without permission. They stood for hours on end, small legs trembling, until they could no longer hold themselves upright. When standing became impossible, they were tied to furniture, their bodies bound, socks wrapped around their eyes. The woman responsible for this nightmare was not a stranger who had kidnapped them. She was not a human trafficker or a random predator. She was their adoptive mother, a woman who had chosen to bring them into her home, a woman who had stood before a judge and promised to care for them. Her name was Gina Emmanuel, and she was a registered nurse. She had dedicated her professional life to healing, to caring for the vulnerable, to preserving human life. But the oath she took as a nurse, the promise to do no harm, meant nothing within the walls of that apartment. On November 3rd, 2018, one of those little girls stopped breathing. 7-year-old Samaya had been sick for days, maybe longer. Her symptoms had worsened progressively, her small body fighting an infection it could not overcome without help. But that help never came. Emmanuel, a trained medical professional who understood exactly what pneumonia looked like, who knew the signs of sepsis, who could have saved her daughter's life with a simple trip to the emergency room, chose to do nothing. She watched Samaya deteriorate. She watched her struggle to breathe. She watched her die. When investigators arrived to examine Samaya's body, they immediately noticed something wrong. The child's small frame bore injuries that had nothing to do with pneumonia. There were burns. There were marks consistent with being struck repeatedly. There were wounds in various stages of healing, telling a story of prolonged, systematic abuse. According to the medical examiner who would later testify at trial, Samaya had sustained injuries all over her body, from her face to her chest, abdomen, back, arms, and legs. The cause of death was determined to be pneumonia and sepsis, but Dr. Emma Liu testified that both acute and chronic abuse had played a role in the child's death. The death of Samaya Emmanuel opened an investigation that would reveal years of torture inflicted on 3 innocent children by the woman who was supposed to protect them. It would take nearly 5 years for the case to come to trial. When it finally did, in April of 2025, a jury would hear testimony that made seasoned prosecutors and investigators sick. They would hear from Samaya's surviving sister, who would recount in excruciating detail what life had been like in that apartment on West Dixie Highway. They would hear about chains and tape and starvation and burns. They would hear about a refrigerator that was locked so the children could not access food. They would hear about how the girls were forced to use a bucket as a toilet. They would hear about how they were made to eat their own feces. This is the story of Gina Emmanuel, a registered nurse who adopted 3 sisters and subjected them to unimaginable cruelty. It is the story of Samaya, who died at age 7 after enduring years of abuse. It is the story of Yana and Samariah Gordon, who survived and found the courage to testify against the woman who tortured them. It is a story about how the systems designed to protect vulnerable children failed. It is a story about how evil can hide behind professional credentials and closed doors. And it is a story about resilience, about 2 young women who emerged from darkness and reclaimed their lives. Gina Emmanuel graduated from Bari University in Miami with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing in 2006. Bari University, a private Catholic institution in Miami Shores, has a well-regarded nursing program that emphasizes both clinical competence and ethical care. Students there learn not just the technical skills of nursing, but also the moral and ethical responsibilities that come with caring for vulnerable patients. They learn about advocacy, about being a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Emmanuel completed this program and passed her licensing examination to become a registered nurse in the state of Florida. Nursing is a profession that attracts people for many reasons. Some are drawn to the stability and career opportunities. Others genuinely want to help people in their most vulnerable moments. Nurses work in high-stress environments, making life-and-death decisions, comforting the suffering, and advocating for patients who cannot advocate for themselves. It is a profession that requires both technical knowledge and emotional intelligence. The public image of nursing tends to be overwhelmingly positive, with nurses consistently ranking among the most trusted professionals in public opinion surveys. For Emmanuel, nursing provided a stable career in South Florida's robust healthcare industry. According to her LinkedIn profile, she worked as a registered nurse in the Miami area, though specific details about her employment history are limited. What is known is that by the time she entered the foster care system as a prospective parent, she had established herself professionally and appeared to have the credentials and stability that child welfare agencies look for in foster parents. She was educated, employed, and presented herself as someone capable of providing a safe and nurturing home. The decision to become a foster parent is significant. It requires undergoing background checks, home studies, and training. Prospective foster parents must demonstrate that they have adequate space, financial resources, and the emotional capacity to care for children who have often experienced trauma. The state of Florida, like most states, is perpetually in need of foster families. Children enter the foster care system for many reasons, most commonly due to abuse, neglect, or parental substance abuse. The goal of foster care is typically reunification with biological parents when possible, but when that is not achievable, adoption becomes the path forward. Emmanuel entered the foster care system and was matched with 4 children, 3 sisters and their brother, in 2014. The state trusted her with their safety. According to prosecutors, the children were Samaya, Samariah, Yana, and Tanya. For 3 years, Emmanuel fostered these children. During that time, caseworkers would have made regular visits to check on the children's well-being. Teachers would have interacted with them if they attended school regularly. Doctors should have seen them for regular checkups. Yet somehow, during those 3 years, the abuse that was occurring went undetected or unreported. In 2017, Emmanuel finalized the adoption of at least 3 of the children. This meant going before a judge and completing the legal process that would make her permanently and legally responsible for their care. Adoption is meant to provide children with stability, permanence, and the opportunity to thrive in a family environment. For Emmanuel, it also meant that oversight from the foster care system would diminish significantly. Once an adoption is finalized, caseworkers no longer make regular visits. The children belong to the adoptive parent in the same way biological children do. This change in legal status can create a dangerous situation if the adoptive parent is abusive, because the safety net of regular monitoring disappears. It remains unclear what Emmanuel's motivations were for fostering and adopting these children. Financial incentives exist within the foster care system, as foster parents receive monthly stipends to help cover the costs of caring for children. Some adoptive parents continue to receive subsidies if the children have special needs. However, these amounts are generally modest and unlikely to constitute a primary motive for taking in children. Some individuals foster and adopt because they genuinely want to expand their families and provide loving homes for children in need. Others may be drawn by more complex psychological needs, including desires for control, power, or the appearance of altruism. What is clear from the evidence presented at trial is that whatever Emmanuel's initial motivations may have been, something went profoundly wrong. According to prosecutors and testimony from the surviving children, Emmanuel had a biological son who lived in the household. This son was treated differently from the adopted children. When the girls were hungry and ate food that had been designated for Emmanuel's biological son, they were severely punished. This differential treatment, This clear distinction between her biological child and her adopted children would become a central element of the abuse. Miami-Dade State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle would later say in a statement following Emmanuel's conviction that no one could ever imagine a trained nurse would beat, torture, and starve children as a means of instilling her vision of discipline. The word discipline is important here. Emmanuel's defense team would later argue that what occurred in the home was corporal punishment, not abuse, though the jury would ultimately reject this characterization entirely. The distinction between discipline and abuse is both legal and moral. Reasonable corporal punishment is permitted under Florida law, but what happened to the Gordon children went far beyond any reasonable definition of discipline. By 2018, the situation in Emmanuel's home had become life-threatening. The children were malnourished, covered in injuries, and living in constant fear. And then Samaya got sick. The Gordon children entered Gina Emmanuel's life through the foster care system, part of a pipeline that is supposed to move children from danger to safety. Their biological grandfather, Robert Gordon, was visually impaired and unable to care for them himself, a reality that would haunt him for years. At the sentencing hearing in 2025, Robert Gordon spoke with a breaking voice about his anger and his wish that he could have been involved sooner in his grandchildren's lives. The pain in his words reflected a broader tragedy: a family torn apart, children vulnerable, and a system that placed them in the care of someone who would harm them. When the state removed the children from their biological family situation in 2014, they ranged in age from toddlers to preteens. Anna was the oldest, followed by Samaya, then Samaya, and the youngest was Tanya. These were children who had already experienced trauma and instability. They needed safety, consistency, and love. They needed adults who would prioritize their well-being and help them heal from whatever had brought them into state custody. Foster care placements are meant to be temporary, providing a safe environment while the state works toward reunification with biological parents, or, when that is not possible, adoption by foster parents or other families. During the foster care period, which for the Gordon children lasted from 2014 to 2017, caseworkers are supposed to make regular visits to ensure the children are being properly cared for. These visits typically occur monthly at minimum, and caseworkers assess the physical environment, the children's health and educational progress, and their emotional well-being. The fact that Emmanuel successfully fostered these children for 3 years and then adopted them suggests that during those years, she either successfully concealed any abuse or the abuse escalated significantly after the adoption was finalized. It is also possible that warning signs were present but were not recognized or properly acted upon by the caseworkers and other professionals involved in the children's lives. This is a disturbing pattern seen in other cases of foster and adoptive parent abuse, where adults who appear competent and caring in public interactions behave very differently in private. According to court records and testimony, the children were adopted in 2017. At that point, Anna was approximately 12 years old, Samaya was 7, and Samaya was 6. The adoption should have been a celebration, a permanent family formed, a new beginning. Instead, it marked the beginning or escalation of a nightmare. Life in the Emmanuel household was characterized by rigid control and harsh punishment. According to prosecutors, the children were not allowed to attend school regularly, which would have provided outside observers with opportunities to notice signs of abuse. When they did attend, there is no public record of teachers or school officials reporting concerns, though this does not necessarily mean no concerns were raised. Only that any such reports did not result in protective action. The children's basic needs were not being met. They were malnourished, a condition that develops over time and indicates prolonged food deprivation. Emmanuel allegedly kept the refrigerator chained and locked, preventing the children from accessing food without her permission. This level of control over food is a hallmark of child abuse, used to exert power and instill fear. The children learned quickly that attempting to eat without permission resulted in severe consequences. One incident that came to light during the investigation illustrates the sadistic nature of Emmanuel's control. According to the arrest report, the children woke up hungry one night and ate food that had been reserved for Emmanuel's biological son. When Emmanuel discovered this, she held both victims' hands down on the hot stove repeatedly until their hands were burned. This was not discipline in any conventional understanding of the term. This was deliberate torture, designed to cause maximum pain and terror. The physical abuse extended beyond burns. According to the police report and later trial testimony, Emmanuel beat the children with belts, brushes, and back scratchers. She made them stand for hours at a time as punishment, and when their small legs could no longer support them, she tied their hands and bodies to furniture to keep them upright. She tied socks around their eyes during some of these punishments. When they wet the bed, which is a common stress response in abused children, she forced them to sleep on the floor. The children were also denied basic dignity. According to testimony and court records, they were forced to use a bucket as a toilet rather than being allowed to use the bathroom. In some instances, they were allegedly forced to eat their own feces, a form of degradation that goes beyond physical pain to psychological torture. These acts were designed to humiliate and dehumanize. Yana, as the oldest, bore witness to all of this. She tried to protect her younger sisters as best she could. According to her statement at the sentencing hearing, she would teach Samaya to read and help her with multiplication tables. The youngest sister memorized that 7 times 2 equals 14, a fact that would become painfully symbolic. Samaya died before her 8th birthday. She would have been 14 years old in 2025, the year her killer was sentenced. The children lived in constant fear. They could not predict when Emmanuel's rage would erupt or what minor infraction might trigger violence. This unpredictability is itself a form of psychological torture, keeping victims in a state of hypervigilance and anxiety. They could not escape. They could not call for help. They were trapped in that apartment with a woman who had absolute power over their lives and who used that power to inflict suffering. And then, in late 2018, Samaya became ill. The methods Emmanuel employed to control and abuse the Gordon children were systematic and calculated. This was not a case of a parent losing control in a moment of frustration, nor was it isolated incidents of excessive discipline. What occurred in the apartment on West Dixie Highway represented a sustained campaign of physical and psychological torture that lasted for years. One of the most significant forms of abuse involved food deprivation. According to court testimony and investigative records, Emmanuel kept the refrigerator chained and locked. The children were given limited meals and were not allowed to help themselves to food. This created a state of chronic hunger and malnourishment. Medical evidence presented at trial indicated that the children were significantly underweight for their ages. Starvation is a particularly cruel form of abuse because it is constant. Unlike a beating that ends, hunger persists, dominating the victim's thoughts and weakening their body. The locked refrigerator also served a psychological purpose beyond simply depriving the children of nutrition. It was a daily reminder of Emmanuel's absolute control. Food was abundant in the home. It was simply being withheld from them. They could see it, smell it, know it was there, but they could not access it. This created a specific kind of psychological torment. When the children did attempt to eat without permission, the consequences were severe. The incident involving Emmanuel's biological son's food resulted in one of the most disturbing acts of abuse documented in the case. According to the police report, when Emmanuel discovered that the girls had eaten food meant for her son, she turned on the stove. She then held both victims' hands down on the hot burner repeatedly until they were burned. This was not a momentary touch. The arrest report specifies that she held their hands down repeatedly, indicating that she burned them, released them, and burned them again. Burns as a method of abuse are particularly revealing. Unlike bruises that might be explained away as accidental, burns of this nature are difficult to attribute to anything other than intentional infliction. The pattern, location, and severity of the burns on the children's hands would have been immediately recognizable to any medical professional as non-accidental trauma. The fact that Emmanuel, herself a registered nurse with medical training, inflicted these injuries demonstrates the calculated nature of her abuse. Physical beatings were regular occurrences in the household. The children were struck with various implements, including belts, brushes, and back scratchers. These were not single strikes, but prolonged beatings that left marks all over their bodies. When medical examiners examined Samaya's body after her death, they found evidence of trauma to her face, chest, abdomen, back, arms, and legs. The medical examiner testified that the child had sustained both acute and chronic injuries, meaning she had wounds that were fresh and wounds in various stages of healing. This pattern indicates repeated, ongoing physical abuse over an extended period. Another method of torture involved forced standing. According to the police report and survivor testimony, Emmanuel would make the children stand for hours as punishment. Anyone who has stood in one place for an extended period knows how quickly it becomes uncomfortable, then painful. For small children with developing bodies, forced standing for hours would have been excruciating. Their legs would have trembled and weakened. Eventually, they would have been unable to maintain the position. When the children could no longer stand on their own, Emmanuel escalated the torture. She tied their hands and bodies to furniture to keep them upright. She used tape and chains for restraint. According to survivor testimony at trial, one of the children told the jury that Emmanuel would chain them, make them lay down, and leave them chained until she returned. These restraints prevented the children from escaping the painful positions or seeking relief. The use of chains specifically is significant. Chains are typically used to restrain large, dangerous animals or prisoners, not children. The choice to use chains on small girls reveals Emmanuel's perception of them as things to be controlled rather than human beings deserving of care. Sensory deprivation was another element of the abuse. Emmanuel tied socks around the children's eyes during punishments. This blindfolding served multiple purposes. It increased the children's fear and disorientation, it prevented them from seeing what was coming next, and it added an additional layer of psychological torment to the physical abuse they were enduring. The bathroom situation in the household constituted another form of degradation. Rather than being allowed to use the toilet normally, the children were forced to urinate and defecate in a bucket. This denial of basic sanitary facilities is a recognized form of abuse that strips victims of dignity and subjects them to unsanitary conditions. According to testimony presented at trial, there were instances where the children were forced to eat their own feces. This act represents perhaps the most extreme form of psychological and physical degradation documented in the case. The distinction between how Emmanuel treated her biological son versus her adopted daughters was stark and consistent. Food that was designated for the biological son was off-limits to the girls. When they violated this rule, they were severely punished. This differential treatment suggests that Emmanuel viewed her adopted children as fundamentally different from and less valuable than her biological child. Whether this distinction was racially motivated, rooted in biological versus adoptive status, or stemmed from some other dark place in Emmanuel's psychology remains a matter of interpretation. What is clear is that she did not view all the children in her care as equally deserving of basic human treatment. Throughout all of this abuse, Emmanuel was able to maintain her professional life as a registered nurse. She went to work, cared for patients, and presumably interacted with colleagues in a manner that did not raise red flags. This compartmentalization is common among abusers who maintain respectable public personas while committing terrible acts in private. The ability to present as normal, even caring, in professional and social contexts while engaging in systematic abuse at home is a characteristic often seen in cases of severe child maltreatment. Medical care for the children was essentially non-existent. According to prosecutors, the children did not see a pediatrician regularly. This lack of medical oversight meant that injuries could go undocumented and untreated. It also meant that when Samaya became seriously ill in late 2018, there was no established relationship with a healthcare provider who might have intervened earlier. The cumulative effect of years of starvation, beatings, burns, restraints, and psychological torture was devastating. The children's physical health was compromised, their emotional development was stunted, and they lived in a constant state of terror. For Samaya, the years of abuse would ultimately prove fatal. Samaya was 7 years old in November of 2018. According to her sister Anna's testimony at the sentencing hearing years later, Samaya was a child who loved to learn. Anna would teach her to read and help her practice multiplication. The last multiplication fact Samaya mastered was 7 times 2 equals 14. It is a small detail, but it speaks volumes about who this child was beneath the trauma. A little girl trying to learn, trying to grow, trying to exist despite the nightmare she was living. The exact timeline of Samaya's final illness is not fully detailed in public court records, but what is known comes from the medical examiner's findings, prosecutor statements, and the arrest report filed in 2019. At some point in late October or early November of 2018, Samaya developed symptoms consistent with a respiratory infection. She had a cough, likely a fever, and difficulty breathing. These symptoms, while concerning, are not uncommon in children, and when properly treated, rarely lead to death. However, Samaya did not receive treatment. Emmanuel, a registered nurse with years of training and experience, did not take her daughter to see a doctor. She did not bring her to an urgent care clinic. She did not even call a pediatrician for advice. According to prosecutors and the arrest report, Emmanuel simply failed to seek medical care for Samaya's symptoms. As days passed, those symptoms worsened. A respiratory infection that begins as something manageable can quickly become dangerous if left untreated, particularly in a malnourished child whose immune system is already compromised. Samaya's infection progressed to pneumonia, a serious inflammation of the lungs that impairs breathing and oxygen exchange. Pneumonia is treatable with antibiotics and supportive care, but without treatment, it can be fatal. In Samaya's case, the pneumonia continued to worsen. As the infection spread and intensified, Samaya's small body was fighting a battle it could not win alone. Her breathing would have become increasingly labored. She would have been coughing constantly. She would have been weak and unable to eat. Anyone observing her would have known she needed immediate medical attention. Emmanuel, with her medical training, would have recognized these symptoms for exactly what they were. Still, no help came. The pneumonia progressed to sepsis, a life-threatening condition that occurs when the body's response to an infection causes widespread inflammation and organ damage. Sepsis is a medical emergency. Once it develops, the window for effective treatment narrows rapidly. Patients with sepsis require hospitalization, intravenous antibiotics, fluid resuscitation, and intensive monitoring. Without these interventions, sepsis is often fatal. Samaya was dying, and Emmanuel did nothing. On November 3, 2018, 7-year-old Samaya stopped breathing. The child who had been learning her multiplication tables, who had survived years of torture and abuse, who had somehow maintained the capacity to learn and grow despite the hell she lived in, was dead. The official cause of death was determined to be pneumonia and sepsis. But according to prosecutors and the medical examiner's testimony at trial, those conditions developed and became fatal because of Emmanuel's deliberate medical neglect. Dr. Emma Liu, the medical examiner who performed Samaya's autopsy, would later testify that the child's death resulted from both acute and chronic abuse. The pneumonia and sepsis were the immediate causes, but they occurred in the context of a body that had been systematically weakened and damaged over time. Samaya was malnourished. She had injuries all over her body in various stages of healing. Her immune system had been compromised by chronic stress and inadequate nutrition. Even if the final illness had been treated, Dr. Liu's testimony suggested that the years of abuse had created conditions that made Samaya more vulnerable to serious complications. When investigators arrived to examine Samaya's body and investigate the circumstances of her death, they immediately noticed suspicious injuries. These were not injuries consistent with pneumonia or sepsis. These were marks of physical trauma, burns, bruises, wounds in various stages of healing. The pattern and distribution of injuries indicated that this child had been subjected to repeated physical abuse. The discovery of these suspicious injuries triggered a deeper investigation. Detectives began interviewing the surviving children. What they heard from Yana and Samaya was horrifying. The girls described years of systematic torture, beatings, starvation, and degradation. They described the locked refrigerator, the chains, the forced standing, the burns on the stove, the bucket they were forced to use as a toilet. They described watching their sister get sicker and sicker while Emmanuel did nothing. Samaya had died because her adoptive mother, a trained nurse who understood exactly how sick the child was and exactly what needed to be done to save her, chose to withhold medical care. Whether this decision was motivated by a desire to conceal the abuse that would have been discovered by medical professionals, by simple cruelty and indifference to Samaya's suffering, or by some combination of factors, the result was the same. A 7-year-old girl died an agonizing, preventable death. The prosecutors who would later try Emmanuel for first-degree murder characterized her failure to seek medical care as a deliberate choice that demonstrated her conscious disregard for Samaya's life. The defense would argue that Emmanuel could not have known how sick Samaya really was, that her decision not to seek care, while wrong, did not constitute murder. But the medical evidence, combined with Emmanuel's professional training, made this defense difficult to sustain. A registered nurse knows what pneumonia looks like. A registered nurse knows what sepsis looks like. Emmanuel watched her daughter die and did nothing to stop it. In the aftermath of Samaya's death, as investigators pieced together what had happened in that apartment, a clearer picture emerged. This was not a case of a child dying from a sudden, unforeseeable medical emergency. This was the culmination of years of abuse and neglect. Samaya's death was the inevitable result of placing vulnerable children in the care of someone who saw them not as human beings deserving of love and protection, but as objects to be controlled and punished. The investigation into Samaya's death began with the discovery of suspicious injuries on her body. When law enforcement and medical examiners responded to the scene, they observed trauma that could not be explained by pneumonia or sepsis alone. These observations triggered a more thorough examination and inquiry into the circumstances of the child's death. Miami-Dade police detectives took the lead on the investigation. Their first priority was to ensure the safety of the surviving children in the household. Gina and Samaya were removed from Emmanuel's care and placed in protective custody. This removal likely saved their lives, as they too bore signs of serious physical abuse. Interviewing child abuse victims is a delicate process that requires specialized training. Children who have experienced trauma may be reluctant to speak about their abuse, particularly if they fear retaliation or feel loyalty to their abuser. They may have been threatened or conditioned to keep silent. The interview process must be careful, patient, and trauma-informed to avoid further harming the child while gathering the information needed to build a case. When detectives interviewed Gina and Samaya, the girls provided detailed accounts of the abuse they had endured. They described specific incidents with clarity that would later prove crucial in court. They told investigators about the locked refrigerator and the chronic hunger. They described the beatings with belts, brushes, and back scratchers. They recounted the night they were hungry and ate food meant for Emmanuel's biological son, and the horrific punishment that followed when their hands were held down on the hot stove. The children described being forced to stand for hours. They described being tied to furniture when they could no longer maintain the standing position. They described having socks tied around their eyes during punishments. They described being forced to use a bucket as a toilet, and in some instances, being forced to eat feces. They described being denied access to school and medical care. And they described watching Samaya become increasingly ill in the days before her death, while Emmanuel did nothing. The girl's testimony was corroborated by physical evidence. Medical examinations revealed burns, scars, and signs of chronic malnourishment. The patterns of injury were consistent with the abuse the children described. Investigators also examined the apartment on West Dixie Highway. They documented the chained refrigerator. They collected evidence of the conditions in which the children had been living. Building a case against Emmanuel required gathering not just evidence of abuse, but evidence that would support a charge of first-degree murder in Samaya's death. Florida law defines first-degree murder as a killing that is premeditated or that occurs during the commission of certain felonies, including aggravated child abuse. Prosecutors would need to prove either that Emmanuel intended to kill Samaya or that Samaya died as a result of Emmanuel's commission of aggravated child abuse. The evidence suggested both theories could be applicable. Emmanuel's failure to seek medical care for a child who was clearly dying could support an argument of premeditated murder, particularly given Emmanuel's medical training and knowledge. Alternatively, Samaya's death occurred in the context of ongoing aggravated child abuse, which would also support a first-degree murder charge under Florida's felony murder rule. The investigation took time. Detectives interviewed neighbors, teachers, and anyone who had contact with the family. They reviewed any available medical records for the children. They worked with the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office to build the strongest possible case. Nearly a year after Samaya's death, on October 15, 2019, Gina Emmanuel was arrested. She was charged with first-degree murder in Samaya's death and with multiple counts of aggravated child abuse related to her treatment of the surviving children. According to news reports from the time, Emmanuel appeared before a Miami-Dade County judge the day after her arrest. The prosecutor emphasized the severity of the case. The judge ordered Emmanuel to have no contact with the surviving children and set her bond at $120,000. The arrest marked the beginning of what would be a long legal process. Emmanuel was facing the most serious charges under Florida law. If convicted of first-degree murder, she would face either life in prison or the death penalty. The aggravated child abuse charges carried additional lengthy prison terms. In the months and years that followed the arrest, the case moved through the court system. Discovery was exchanged, motions were filed, and legal arguments were made. The Florida Department of Children and Families also reviewed the case to understand how the abuse had gone undetected for so long. Questions were raised about the adequacy of oversight during the foster care period and after the adoption was finalized. The surviving children, meanwhile, were placed in new foster care arrangements. They began the long process of healing from years of trauma. According to later reports, they were placed in homes where they were safe and cared for. Gina, in particular, would prove to be remarkably resilient, though the scars of what she endured would never fully disappear. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors prepared to present the full scope of Emmanuel's crimes to a jury. They would call the surviving children to testify, knowing how difficult and potentially re-traumatizing that experience would be for them. They would present medical evidence, photographic evidence, and expert testimony. They would build a comprehensive picture of what had happened in that apartment on West Dixie Highway. In March of 2025, Emmanuel rejected a plea offer. Prosecutors had offered her a 25-year prison sentence in exchange for pleading guilty. This offer would have spared the surviving children the trauma of testifying and would have guaranteed a significant prison term. Emmanuel's rejection of this offer meant the case would go to trial, and she would face the possibility of life in prison. The trial was scheduled to begin in April of 2025, more than 6 years after Samaya's death and more than 5 years after Emmanuel's arrest. Gina Gordon was 12 years old when she was adopted by Gina Emmanuel. By the time she testified at Emmanuel's trial in April of 2025, she was 18. In the 6 years between her adoption and her testimony, Gina had endured years of torture, lost her 7-year-old sister, been removed from Emmanuel's care, and begun the long process of rebuilding her life. Testifying in a criminal trial is difficult under any circumstances. For a survivor of child abuse testifying against her abuser, the experience is exponentially more challenging. Gina would have to sit in a courtroom full of strangers, including Emmanuel herself, and recount in detail the worst experiences of her life. She would be cross-examined by defense attorneys whose job was to challenge her testimony and credibility. She would have to relive trauma that she was still working to process and heal from. Despite these challenges, Gina took the stand. According to news reports, her testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. She described the abuse she and her sisters had endured in Emmanuel's care. She told the jury about being chained. One particularly powerful moment in her testimony came when she told jurors, in Emmanuel's own presence, that Emmanuel would chain them, make them lay down, and lock them in place until she returned. Yana described the hunger that dominated their lives. She explained how the refrigerator was chained shut and how they were given limited food. She testified about the beatings, the burns, the forced standing, the degradation. She told the jury what it was like to watch her 7-year-old sister, Samaya, get sicker and sicker while Emmanuel refused to get help. The defense attempted to minimize the abuse, arguing that what occurred was corporal punishment rather than abuse. Defense attorneys told the jury that yes, there was punishment, but it was reasonable corporal punishment allowed by law, not child abuse. They argued that Emmanuel could not have known how sick Samaya was, that while she should have taken the child to the hospital, her failure to do so was not murder. Yana's testimony, combined with medical evidence and other witnesses, directly contradicted this narrative. The jury heard not about occasional spankings or groundings, but about systematic torture. They heard about chains and starvation and burns that were inflicted intentionally and repeatedly. They heard about a child who died because a registered nurse chose not to provide basic medical care. Samaya, Samaya's younger sister, was also among the survivors, though less is publicly known about her specific testimony or current circumstances. She too would have witnessed and experienced the abuse in Emmanuel's home. She too watched Samaya die. The trauma she carries is immeasurable. The courage it took for these young women to come forward and testify cannot be overstated. Miami-Dade State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle specifically noted in her statement following the verdict that one should admire the courage it took for Samaya's sister, 12 years old at the time of the abuse, to come forward and testify in court before judges, lawyers, jurors, and others in order for the truth to be told. Yana was forced to confront the woman who had tortured her, to speak her truth in a public forum, and to withstand cross-examination designed to undermine her credibility. Survivors of child abuse often struggle with feelings of guilt, shame, and self-blame. They may have been conditioned by their abusers to believe that the abuse was their fault or that speaking about it would result in terrible consequences. They may fear not being believed. They may have complicated feelings toward their abuser, particularly when the abuser is a parental figure. Overcoming these barriers to testify requires immense strength. In addition to the surviving children, other witnesses testified at trial. The medical examiner provided detailed testimony about Samaya's injuries and the cause of her death. Dr. Emma Liu explained that Samaya had sustained injuries all over her body, from her face to her chest, abdomen, back, arms, and legs. She testified that the cause of death was pneumonia and sepsis, but that both acute and chronic abuse played a role. This testimony established the medical basis for the murder charge. Investigators who had worked the case also testified, describing what they found when they searched Emmanuel's apartment and interviewed the children. They presented evidence of the conditions in which the children lived. They described the chained refrigerator, the bucket used as a toilet, and the other physical evidence of abuse. The prosecution painted a picture of sustained, deliberate cruelty. They asked the jury to consider what else was going to happen as a result of the choices Emmanuel made. The answer was clear. Samaya's death was the inevitable result of years of abuse and medical neglect. The defense's argument that Emmanuel's actions constituted discipline rather than abuse was undermined by the sheer weight of evidence. The jury heard testimony about food deprivation severe enough to cause malnourishment. They heard about burns inflicted by holding children's hands on a hot stove. They heard about chains and restraints. They heard about a child who died because the adult responsible for her care refused to seek medical treatment. This was not discipline. This was torture. After hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury began their deliberations. The case was complex, with multiple charges and years of alleged abuse to consider. But the deliberations did not take long. The evidence was overwhelming. Opening statements in the murder trial of Gina Emmanuel began on April 10, 2025, more than 6 years after Samaya's death. The courtroom was a Miami-Dade County courthouse, and the stakes could not have been higher. Emmanuel, now 56 years old, faced 1 count of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated child abuse with great bodily harm, and charges related to torture. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorneys Christina Diamond and Kristen Rodriguez, presented their opening statement with careful attention to the facts and evidence. According to news reports, the prosecutor told the jury they would learn about the defendant's control. This framing was significant. The case was not just about isolated acts of violence, but about a pattern of domination and systematic abuse. Prosecutors outlined the specific acts of abuse the jury would hear about during the trial. They told jurors about the chained refrigerator. They described how the 3 girls were forced to urinate and defecate in a bucket. They explained that the children were malnourished, whipped, and did not see a pediatrician. The prosecution established early that this was not a case about parenting choices or cultural differences in discipline. This was a case about sustained torture of 3 vulnerable children. The state's theory of the case was straightforward. Emmanuel's treatment of the children constituted aggravated child abuse, and Samaya's death was the logical result of that abuse. The prosecutor asked the jury directly, what else was gonna happen as a result of the choices she made? This question went to the heart of the first-degree murder charge. Under Florida law, a death that occurs during the commission of certain felonies, including aggravated child abuse, can constitute first-degree murder even without proof of premeditation. The defense, in their opening statement, attempted to reframe the case. Defense attorneys told the jury, yes, there was punishment, but it was reasonable corporal punishment allowed by law. Not child abuse. This was a risky strategy, as it essentially admitted that physical punishment occurred, but asked the jury to view it as lawful discipline. The defense also argued that Emmanuel could not have known how sick Samaya was, and that while she should have taken the child to the hospital, her failure to do so did not constitute murder. The trial proceeded with witness testimony. Gina Gordon took the stand and provided detailed testimony about the abuse she and her sisters endured. She told the jury that Emmanuel would chain them and lock them in place. She described the conditions in the home, the food deprivation, the beatings, and the degradation. Her testimony was powerful and credible. The medical examiner, Dr. Emma Liu, provided expert testimony about Samaya's injuries and cause of death. She explained that Samaya had sustained trauma all over her body. She testified that the child died from pneumonia and sepsis, but that both acute and chronic abuse played a role in the death. This testimony was crucial in establishing the connection between Emmanuel's abuse and Samaya's death. Other witnesses provided testimony about the investigation, the conditions in Emmanuel's home, and the evidence collected. The prosecution presented photographic evidence, medical records, and other documentary evidence. They built a comprehensive case that showed not just what happened to Samaya, but the broader pattern of abuse that characterized Emmanuel's treatment of all 3 girls. The defense cross-examined witnesses and presented their own arguments. They attempted to raise questions about the severity of the abuse and Emmanuel's knowledge of Samaya's condition, but the weight of evidence was difficult to overcome. The children's testimony was detailed and consistent. The medical evidence corroborated their accounts. The physical evidence from the home supported the prosecution's narrative. After several days of testimony, both sides rested their cases. Closing arguments allowed each side to make their final appeal to the jury. The prosecution emphasized the systematic nature of the abuse, the suffering the children endured, and Emmanuel's deliberate choices that led to Samaya's death. The defense continued to argue that the abuse did not rise to the level of first-degree murder. The jury began deliberations on Monday evening, April 14, 2025. They reviewed the evidence and testimony, considered the charges, and discussed the case. The deliberations were relatively short, particularly given the complexity of the case and the seriousness of the charges. By noon on Tuesday, April 15th, the jury had reached a verdict. Emmanuel was brought back into the courtroom. The judge, jurors, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and spectators filled the room. According to news reports, Gina Gordon was present to hear the verdict. After 6 years of waiting, after years of carrying the weight of what she had experienced and witnessed, after the trauma of testifying, she was about to learn whether the justice system would hold her abuser accountable. The clerk read the verdicts. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Samaya Emmanuel, guilty. On the first count of aggravated child abuse, guilty. On the second count of aggravated child abuse, guilty. Gina Emmanuel showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. She stood impassively, her face revealing nothing. This lack of reaction was noted by observers and would be remembered 2 weeks later at her sentencing. Gina Gordon, in contrast, felt a mix of emotions. Speaking to reporters after the verdict, she said, "I'm not gonna say it was easy. It's mentally exhausting, but it's over, so it's not fair that she took someone's life. I mean, they were a child, she was only 7, so it's not fair." The guilty verdicts meant that Emmanuel would face severe punishment. First-degree murder in Florida carries either a life sentence or the death penalty. The aggravated child abuse convictions carried additional lengthy prison terms. Sentencing would occur at a later date. State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle issued a statement following the verdict. She said, "The guilty verdict in Gina Emmanuel's first-degree murder and child abuse trial brought to the light of day the horrors 7-year-old Samaya so tragically suffered before her death. No one could ever imagine that a trained nurse would beat, torture, and starve Samaya and her 2 adopted sisters as a means of instilling the defendant's vision of discipline." She went on to note that the jury fully understood that Emmanuel ultimately ignored the suffering of young Samaya, which led to the child's death. For Gina Gordon, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She told reporters outside the courthouse that it was not easy, that the process had been mentally exhausting, but it was over. She emphasized the injustice of what had happened. Emmanuel had taken someone's life, and that person was a child, only 7 years old. The verdict could not bring Samaya back, but it acknowledged the truth of what had happened in that apartment on West Dixie Highway. The conviction was also significant for the broader community. It demonstrated that even someone with professional credentials and social standing could be held accountable for abuse. It sent a message that the criminal justice system, despite its many flaws and failures, could sometimes deliver justice for the most vulnerable victims. On April 30th, 2025, 15 days after the guilty verdicts were read, Gina Emmanuel returned to a Miami-Dade County courtroom for sentencing. Judge Christina Miranda presided over the hearing. The courtroom was packed with supporters of the Gordon family, detectives who had worked the case, and others who had followed the trial and wanted to see justice served. First-degree murder in Florida carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. There was no possibility of a lesser sentence for that charge. The aggravated child abuse convictions carried additional prison terms. But before Judge Miranda imposed the sentence, the court heard victim impact statements from those whose lives had been forever altered by Emmanuel's crimes. Gina Gordon, now 18 years old, stood before the court to address the woman who had tortured her and killed her sister. According to news reports, Gordon spoke directly to Emmanuel, who sat emotionless at the defense table. Gordon recalled how Emmanuel used to refer to herself as a tough cookie. In response, Gordon told her, "I'm tougher than you could imagine." She described her role caring for her younger sister Samaya, teaching her to read and helping her with multiplication tables. She shared the poignant detail about the last multiplication fact Samaya memorized. 7 times 2 equals 14. Samaya would have been 14 years old in 2025, the year her killer was sentenced. Then Gina Gordon delivered a line that would be quoted in news coverage across the country. Looking at Emmanuel, she said, "Don't do the crime if you can't do the time. I'm letting God take this wheel. With that now said, I wish you well in hell." The directness and power of her words reflected years of pain and the strength she had found to survive and speak her truth. Robert Gordon, the girl's visually impaired grandfather, was also present in the courtroom. Gina helped guide him to the witness stand so he could address Emmanuel. His voice breaking with emotion, he spoke about his anger at learning that Emmanuel was not apologizing to her victims during the hearing. He said he wished he could have been involved sooner in his grandchildren's lives. Facing Emmanuel directly, he said, "I think about inflicting pain on you every day." He told her he could forgive, but could never forget what she had done to his grandchildren. He acknowledged he could not inflict the pain he wished he could, but he said he would leave that to the women in prison. Throughout these victim impact statements, Emmanuel showed no emotion. She sat impassively, her face revealing nothing. She was given an opportunity to speak, to express remorse, to apologize to the people she had harmed. She chose not to. According to multiple news reports, Emmanuel declined to address the court. Her silence spoke volumes about her character and her continued refusal to take responsibility for the horror she had inflicted. Judge Miranda then imposed sentence. For the first-degree murder of Samaya, Emmanuel was sentenced to life in prison. For each of the 2 counts of aggravated child abuse with great bodily harm, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The 2 30-year sentences were ordered to run concurrently with each other and with the life sentence. This meant Emmanuel's total sentence was life in prison plus 30 years. At 56 years old at the time of sentencing, Emmanuel will spend the rest of her natural life in a Florida state prison. She will never be eligible for parole. She will never walk free again. The apartment on West Dixie Highway, where she once wielded absolute power over 3 vulnerable children, is behind her. Now she lives in a cell, her freedom stripped away just as she stripped away the freedom and dignity of the children in her care. Emmanuel's defense team announced their intention to appeal the conviction. This is a standard practice in serious criminal cases, but given the strength of the evidence and testimony at trial, the likelihood of a successful appeal appears remote. The children's testimony was detailed and consistent. The medical evidence was compelling. The physical evidence from the home corroborated the accounts of abuse. Multiple witnesses and experts supported the prosecution's case. An appellate court would need to find significant legal errors that affected the outcome of the trial in order to overturn the conviction, and no such errors have been publicly identified. After the sentencing, Gina Gordon walked out of the Miami-Dade County courthouse holding a celebratory cake. The image was captured by photographers and became symbolic of her resilience and triumph. She had survived years of torture. She had lost her sister. She had endured the trauma of testifying at trial. And now, finally, she had seen her abuser held accountable. The cake represented not just celebration of the sentence, but celebration of survival, of finding a way to move forward despite everything she had been through. In a statement following the sentencing, prosecutors emphasized the importance of the verdict and sentence in bringing justice for Samaya and her sisters. State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle had previously praised the courage it took for Gina to come forward and testify, noting that she was only 12 years old at the time of the abuse. The successful prosecution of Emmanuel was the result of years of work by detectives, prosecutors, medical examiners, and other professionals who refused to let Samaya's death go unanswered. For Gina and Samaya Gordon, the sentencing marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The legal process was over. Emmanuel would never hurt them again, but the work of healing from years of trauma would continue. The scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, yet they had shown remarkable strength and resilience, qualities that would serve them well as they built new lives free from the woman who had tried to destroy them. The case of Gina Emmanuel and the Gordon children raises deeply disturbing questions about how such severe abuse could occur for years without intervention. These children were not hidden away in some remote location. They lived in a populated area of Miami-Dade County. They had been in the foster care system, which is supposed to include regular monitoring and oversight. They had been adopted through a legal process that is meant to ensure the safety and well-being of children. Yet from 2014, when Emmanuel began fostering them, until November 2018, when Samaya died, the systematic abuse continued. Foster care in the United States is a system designed to protect children who cannot safely remain with their biological families. When the state removes children from a home due to abuse or neglect, it takes on the responsibility of ensuring their safety and well-being. Foster parents undergo background checks, home studies, and training before being approved to care for children. Once children are placed in a foster home, caseworkers are supposed to make regular visits to monitor the placement and ensure the children are being properly cared for. During the 3 years that Emmanuel fostered the Gordon children before adopting them, these monitoring visits should have occurred. Caseworkers should have interviewed the children, observed their physical condition, and assessed the home environment. Teachers should have interacted with the children if they attended school regularly. Medical professionals should have examined the children during routine checkups. Any of these professionals could have potentially noticed signs of abuse and reported their concerns. The fact that the abuse went undetected or unreported during the foster care period raises serious questions about the adequacy of oversight. Were caseworkers making their required visits? If so, were they conducting thorough assessments or simply checking boxes on a form? Were the children able to speak privately with caseworkers, or was a manual always present during visits? Were there any reports of concern that were not properly investigated? These questions remain largely unanswered in the public record. According to trial testimony, the children did not attend school regularly. This irregular attendance is itself a warning sign of potential abuse or neglect. Children who are being abused may be kept home from school to prevent teachers or other students from noticing injuries. They may be kept home because the abuser does not want the child to have contact with mandatory reporters who might intervene. The fact that a manual was able to keep the children home from school without apparently triggering an investigation suggests a failure in the educational monitoring system. Medical care for the children was essentially non-existent. According to prosecutors, the children did not see a pediatrician regularly. This lack of medical oversight meant that injuries went undocumented and untreated. It also meant that there was no established relationship with a healthcare provider who might have noticed signs of abuse or neglect. Florida law requires children in foster care to receive regular medical and dental checkups. If these checkups occurred for the Gordon children, the records are not part of the public court documents. If they did not occur, that represents a significant failure in the monitoring system. In 2017, a manual finalized the adoption of the children. This should have been a positive milestone, providing the children with permanency and stability. However, adoption also significantly reduces oversight. Once an adoption is finalized, caseworkers no longer make regular visits. The adoptive parent has the same legal rights and responsibilities as a biological parent, and the state's monitoring role essentially ends. This creates a potential vulnerability for children being adopted by abusive parents, as the safety net of regular monitoring disappears. After the adoption was finalized, the responsibility for detecting abuse fell primarily to community members, teachers, doctors, and others who might have contact with the children. But if the children were not attending school regularly and were not receiving medical care, these potential points of intervention did not exist. The children were effectively isolated, which is a common tactic used by abusers to maintain control and prevent discovery. Neighbors at the apartment complex on West Dixie Highway apparently did not report concerns to authorities. This is not necessarily surprising, as abuse often occurs behind closed doors where neighbors cannot see or hear what is happening. However, in some child abuse cases, neighbors do report suspicious activities, sounds of children crying or screaming, or observations of children who appear malnourished or injured. Whether any such concerns were present, but unreported in this case, is not clear from public records. The fact that Emmanuel was a registered nurse may have contributed to the failure of various systems to detect the abuse. Healthcare professionals are generally viewed as trustworthy and competent. When a nurse or doctor is involved in child welfare, there may be an unconscious assumption that the children are in good hands. Caseworkers, teachers, and others may have been less vigilant or less suspicious because Emmanuel had professional credentials that suggested she was capable and responsible. This phenomenon, sometimes called professional privilege, can create blind spots that allow abuse to continue undetected. Following Samaya's death and the subsequent investigation and prosecution, the Florida Department of Children and Families would have conducted an internal review of the case. Such reviews are standard practice when a child in the child welfare system dies or is seriously injured. The purpose of these reviews is to identify any failures in the system and make recommendations to prevent similar tragedies in the future. However, the results of any such review in the Emmanuel case have not been made publicly. The broader question raised by this case is how to better protect children in foster care and adoptive placements. No system can guarantee that abuse will never occur, but there are steps that can be taken to reduce risk. More frequent and more thorough monitoring of foster placements could help identify problems earlier. Better training for caseworkers in recognizing signs of abuse could improve detection. Ensuring that children have opportunities to speak privately with caseworkers, teachers, or other trusted adults could provide avenues for disclosure. Requiring regular medical and dental care for all children in state custody, with documentation reviewed by caseworkers, could create another layer of protection. Educational attendance should also be closely monitored for children in foster care and adoptive placements. When a child is frequently absent from school without clear legitimate reasons, that should trigger an investigation. Schools should be empowered and required to report concerns about children in the child welfare system. The Emmanuel case also highlights the importance of post-adoption support and monitoring. While it is true that finalized adoptions should provide permanency and should not be subject to the same level of intrusion as foster placements, there may be value in maintaining some level of contact and support for families, particularly in cases where children have experienced trauma or have special needs. This could take the form of voluntary support services, required check-ins during the first year post-adoption, or other mechanisms that balance family autonomy with child safety. Ultimately, the failure to protect the Gordon children from years of abuse represents a collective failure of multiple systems and individuals. The children paid the price for those failures. Samaya paid with her life. Gina and Samaya paid with years of suffering and trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The question now is whether the systems designed to protect vulnerable children will learn from this tragedy and implement changes that might prevent similar cases in the future. The aftermath and healing. In the years since their removal from Gina Emmanuel's care in 2018, Gina and Samaya Gordon have been on a journey of healing and rebuilding. The process of recovering from years of systematic torture and abuse is long and complex, with no clear endpoint. The trauma they experience does not simply disappear once the abuser is removed from their lives. It leaves lasting effects on mental health, physical health, relationships, and sense of self. After being removed from Emmanuel's apartment following Samaya's death, the girls were placed in new foster care arrangements. According to later reports, they were placed in homes where they were safe and cared for. This transition itself can be challenging for children who have experienced severe abuse. They may struggle to trust new caregivers. They may have difficulty adjusting to environments where they are treated with kindness rather than cruelty. They may experience anxiety about whether the abuse will somehow start again. By the time of Emmanuel's sentencing in April 2025, Gina was 18 years old. She had aged out of the foster care system and was legally an adult. The poise and strength she displayed during her testimony at trial and at the sentencing hearing suggested that she had access to support and resources that helped her begin to heal. Her ability to speak directly to Emmanuel, to reclaim her narrative, and to assert her own strength represented a significant step in her recovery. The image of Gina walking out of the courthouse carrying a celebratory cake became symbolic of survival and resilience. It showed a young woman who had every reason to be broken by what she had endured, but who instead chose to celebrate her victory. That celebration was not just about Emmanuel's sentence. It was about Gina's own survival and her determination to build a life beyond the trauma. For Samaya, who was younger and whose current circumstances are less documented in public records, the healing journey continues. She too carries the memories of years of abuse and the loss of her sister. She too must work to build a sense of safety and normalcy in her life. The fact that she was present in the courtroom for Emmanuel's sentencing suggests that she too wanted to see justice served and to reclaim some sense of power over her own story. The Gordon children's biological grandfather, Robert Gordon, also continues to carry the weight of what happened. His statement at the sentencing hearing revealed the pain of knowing his grandchildren suffered while he was unable to help them. His visual impairment prevented him from caring for them himself, and they were placed in state custody, which was supposed to keep them safe. Instead, they were placed with someone who tortured them. The guilt and anger he expressed are natural responses to such a betrayal. Samaya's death leaves a permanent absence in her family. She will never grow up, never attend school, never have the opportunity to heal from the trauma she experienced. Her sisters live with the grief of losing her, compounded by the knowledge that her death was preventable. The multiplication fact she memorized before she died, 7 times 2 equals 14, has become a painful reminder of the life she should have had. She would have been 14 in 2025. Instead, she died at 7. Healing from child abuse requires comprehensive support. Survivors often benefit from trauma-focused therapy that helps them process their experiences and develop coping strategies. They may need medical care to address physical health issues resulting from abuse and neglect. They benefit from stable, supportive relationships with caregivers who understand trauma and can provide consistent care. Educational support can help them catch up academically if their education was disrupted by abuse. For child abuse survivors who testify in criminal trials, the legal process itself can be both healing and re-traumatizing. Testifying allows survivors to tell their story and be believed, which can be empowering. Seeing their abuser convicted and sentenced can provide a sense of justice and closure. However, the process of testifying requires reliving traumatic experiences in a public setting, being cross-examined by defense attorneys, and facing the abuser in court. This can be extremely difficult and may trigger trauma responses. The support that Gina and Samaya had around them during the trial and sentencing, including family members, detectives who worked their case, and other supporters who filled the courtroom, likely played an important role in helping them through this process. Knowing that people believed them, supported them, and wanted to see justice served can reinforce survivors' sense of worth and validation. Looking forward, Gina and Samaya face the challenge of building adult lives in the shadow of their childhood trauma. Research on adult survivors of childhood abuse shows that while the effects of trauma can be long-lasting, healing and growth are possible. Many survivors go on to lead fulfilling lives, form healthy relationships, and even use their experiences to help others. The strength and resilience that Gina demonstrated in her testimony and statements suggest that she has the potential to not just survive, but to thrive. A community of people who supported the Gordon children throughout the legal process, including law enforcement officers who investigated the case, prosecutors who fought for justice, and others who showed up to support them in court, played a crucial role. These individuals helped demonstrate to Gina and Samaya that there are adults who will fight to protect children and hold abusers accountable. This is an important message for children who have learned through their abuse that adults cannot be trusted. As the years pass and distance grows from the immediate trauma, the hope is that Gina and Samaya will continue to heal, to build lives defined by more than what was done to them, and to find peace despite carrying scars that will never fully disappear. Their courage in speaking out has ensured that Samaya's story was told, that Emmanuel was held accountable, and that the truth of what happened in that apartment on West Dixie Highway could no longer be hidden. The case of Gina Emmanuel forces us to confront a disturbing reality. People who present as responsible, educated, and caring can commit unspeakable acts of cruelty behind closed doors. Emmanuel was a registered nurse, a profession associated with healing and compassion. She had completed years of education and training. She had passed background checks to become a foster parent. She appeared stable and capable enough that the state entrusted her with the care of 4 vulnerable children. Yet she systematically tortured those children for years and ultimately caused the death of a 7-year-old girl. Understanding what drives such behavior is complex. Experts in child abuse and criminal psychology have identified various factors that can contribute to severe child maltreatment, though no single explanation accounts for all cases. Some abusers have histories of being abused themselves, though it is important to note that most people who experience childhood abuse do not go on to become abusers. Some have mental health conditions or personality disorders that impair their ability to empathize with others or control their impulses. Some abuse children as a way of exerting power and control, deriving satisfaction from dominating vulnerable victims. In Emmanuel's case, certain patterns emerge from the evidence presented at trial. The systematic nature of the abuse, the use of food deprivation and physical torture as methods of control, and the differential treatment of her biological son versus her adopted daughters all suggest that the abuse was about power and control rather than discipline gone too far. The deliberate infliction of pain, the humiliation, and the denial of basic needs and dignity indicate a level of cruelty that goes beyond even severe physical abuse. The fact that Emmanuel was able to maintain her professional life while engaging in systematic abuse at home demonstrates a capacity for compartmentalization. She could apparently function in her role as a nurse, caring for patients and interacting appropriately with colleagues, while returning home to torture children. This split between public persona and private behavior is characteristic of many individuals who commit serious crimes while maintaining respectable outward appearances. Emmanuel's refusal to express remorse or apologize at her sentencing hearing is also telling. Many convicted criminals, even those who committed terrible acts, eventually express some form of remorse, whether genuine or strategic. Emmanuel's silence and emotionless demeanor suggest either a profound lack of empathy or a continued unwillingness to accept responsibility for her actions. This absence of remorse makes it even more clear that the life sentence she received was appropriate and necessary. The question of why Emmanuel chose to foster and adopt children if she intended to abuse them is one that may never be fully answered. Financial incentives exist within the foster care system, as foster parents receive monthly stipends. Some abusers do foster and adopt children primarily for financial gain. However, the amounts involved are generally modest and would not constitute a significant income. It is more likely that Emmanuel's motivations were psychological, related to desires for control, power, or the appearance of altruism. The differential treatment of Emmanuel's biological son compared to her adopted daughters raises questions about whether race, adoption status, or other factors played a role in her willingness to abuse some children while sparing others. Food that was designated for her son was off-limits to the girls, and violating this rule resulted in severe punishment. This suggests that Emmanuel viewed the children differently and valued them unequally. Whether this stemmed from the biological versus adoptive relationship, from racial differences, if such differences existed, or from other factors remains unclear. What is clear is that Emmanuel's abuse of the Gordon children represents a profound betrayal of trust. These were children who had already experienced trauma and instability in their lives. They were placed in Emmanuel's care because they needed safety and nurturing. Instead, they experienced years of torture that culminated in one child's death. The betrayal is compounded by the fact that Emmanuel was a healthcare professional who had sworn an oath to do no harm. She understood human physiology, pain, and suffering in ways that most people do not. She used that knowledge not to heal, but to inflict maximum suffering. For those trying to make sense of this case, it is important to resist the temptation to view Emmanuel as a monster fundamentally different from other human beings. While her actions were monstrous, she was a person who made choices. She chose to abuse vulnerable children. She chose to inflict pain. She chose to withhold medical care from a dying child. These were choices, and she must be held accountable for them. At the same time, cases like this should prompt broader reflection on how society can better protect children and prevent such abuse from occurring. The Emmanuel case also serves as a reminder that child abuse can occur in any community, at any socioeconomic level, and can be perpetrated by people with any level of education or professional status. Vigilance, strong child protection systems, and willingness to report concerns when children may be at risk are essential to preventing and detecting abuse. In the end, understanding why someone like Gina Emmanuel would torture and kill children may be less important than ensuring that such crimes are detected earlier, that children are protected more effectively, and that when abuse does occur, perpetrators are held fully accountable. The guilty verdict and life sentence in this case represent justice served, but they cannot undo the suffering inflicted on 3 innocent children. They cannot bring Samaya back. They can only ensure that Emmanuel will never harm another child.